You're listening to the MindPod Network. This episode of the It's All Happening podcast is brought to you by Bel Sante Beauty, the best in organic, non-synthetic, non-GMO, locally sourced beauty products. Visit etsy.com/shop/Bel Sante Beauty. It's all happening. 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 It's all Dear Steve and Anita, Rachel finished her work on Earth and left the stage in a manner that leaves those of us left behind with a cry of agony in our hearts. As the fragile thread of our faith is dealt with so violently, is anyone strong enough to stay conscious through such teaching as you are receiving? Probably very few. And even they would have only a whisper of equanimity and peace amidst the screaming trumpets of their rage, grief, horror, and desolation. I can't assuage your pain with any words, nor should I, for your pain is Rachel's legacy to you. Not that she or I would inflict such pain by choice, but there it is. And it must burn its purifying way to completion, for something in you dies when you bear the unbearable, and it is only that dark night of the soul that you are prepared to see as God sees, and to love as God loves. Now is the time to let your grief find expression, no false strength. Now is the time to sit quietly and speak to Rachel, and thank her for being with you these few years, and encourage her to go on with whatever her work is, knowing that you will grow in compassion and wisdom from this experience. In my heart, I know that you and she will meet again and again, and recognize the many ways in which you have known each other. And when you meet, you will know in a flash what now it is not given to you to know, why this had to be the way it was. Our rational minds can never understand what has happened, but our hearts, if we can keep them open to God, will find their own intuitive way. Rachel came through you to do her work on earth, which includes her manner of death. Now her soul is free, and the love you can share with her is invulnerable to the winds of changing time and space. In that deep love, include me. In love, Ram Dass. And welcome to the podcast. It's All Happening with Zach Leary. That is me, your host. Episode 108. How cool is that? Oh, wow. And yes, I know we start off the podcast on a heavy note, but that's okay. Sometimes it's necessary. That is a letter that Ram Dass wrote years ago to two parents who lost their young daughter, tragically and suddenly. And I really think it is the mother of all grief letters. It is so profound and so on point about suffering, the nature of loss, the nature of death, soul's transcendence. It's really just amazing. If you Google a letter to Rachel by Ram Dass, you'll find it. And the reason I shared that is because this week's guest is a wonderful woman. Her name is Megan Devine, and wrote a book called It's Okay That You're Not Okay, Meeting Grief and Loss in a Culture That Doesn't Understand. And if you go refugeingrief.com, you can learn about everything that she's doing there. And of course, getting into this field, she had a very specific tragic event that shaped her life in an instant, and she transformed her path, her life, and everything she does to have a very, very unique perspective on grief. I have to say that up front, and I really enjoyed our talk. So we're going to get into that in a minute. But first, a message from our sponsor. When on the road, traveling through the nooks and crannies of the vast neighborhoods of humanity, now and then you come across someone or something that is doing something really special. Something so special that it leaves a deep impression on your consciousness and you want to share it with the whole world. This happened to me over Thanksgiving weekend in Boise, Idaho. It was so inspiring that these 70s soft rock cheesy ballad chord progressions came oozing out of my heart and into this commercial. But really what happened was, I met a woman named Sarah Jo, who is a modern-day whole-body alchemist who has transformed her kitchen into a Willy Wonka-like all-organic lotion and potion wonder lab, intent on creating some of the best all-natural bath and beauty products available today. These products have taken the form of Belle Sante Beauty, B-E-L-L-E, Sante, S-A-N-T-E, Beauty, and they will make your skin sparkle. They will transform your bath into a CBD-infused healing zone and make your life force glow like never before. One of the most powerful forms of enacting social change in the world today is how and where and with who we spend our money. Every holiday season, we have that choice to support the giant corporate behemoth that has huge amounts of marketing dollars and uses them to shove all these crazy messages full of all sorts of incentives and false promises down our throats and into our consciousness every year. Or you can support the little guy. There are lots of people like Belle Sante Beauty who are out there making products and creating them and offering them out into the world for the sole intention of trying to make the world a better place with their own little touch of love and innovation and inspiration. Belle Sante Beauty is certainly one of those companies. Go to etsy.com/shop/Belle Sante Beauty. That's BELLESANTE Beauty. Belle Sante Beauty. Etsy.com/shop Belle Sante Beauty. This holiday season, do yourself a favor. Make your body and your skin and your hair and your inner vibrations sparkle like never before, and give this wonderful company a chance for your magical holiday shopping. So yes, thank you to our sponsor, Belle Sante Beauty, BELLSANTE. Yes, Belle Sante Beauty. Thank you so much for that. And yes, this week on the podcast, Megan Devine, the author of It's Okay That You're Not Okay, Meeting Grief and Loss in a Culture That Doesn't Understand. You know, at some point in life, everybody's going to confront grief in some way, shape, or form. Especially as you get older, people are going to start completing their incarnations and moving on to the next. And, being prepared, being ready, at least having a perspective on what to do next, I think is an important tool set to have in your heart, in your consciousness, in your brain. And I really enjoyed this talk with Megan. She's a very smart, thoughtful, eloquent individual and has a very, very clear perspective and point of view on grief work, and has a lot of opinions, which I think are interesting. Enjoy the podcast and check out her book. Thanks. Megan Devine, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And your book, It's Okay That You're Not Okay, made its way across my desk, across my kitchen table, and I found a lot of really importance in it. And my life has definitely had a fair amount of grief and some loss, maybe a little bit more than average, I would say. But it wasn't just a personal identification. I mean, I really love your subheading of the book, Meeting Grief and Loss in a Culture That Doesn't Understand. And I just feel in the culture that doesn't understand, specifically America, or the West, I should say. I shouldn't say America, but the West. Yeah, our relationship with grief, and especially death, it is just so lost and so confusing. Is that what you find?
Yeah. the way that Western culture comes to pain of any kind, right? I mean, my focus, my lens is pretty tight on grief related to death, typically. But what I'm really speaking to is a much bigger issue, which is we don't hear pain very well in this culture. We insist that everything has a silver lining and everything works out for the best. And it's just not true.
That everything works out for the best. But do you mean that short term and long term? I mean, like, because on one hand, I mean, I'm also, a yogi and pretty well versed in Eastern mysticism and do subscribe to, a huge portion of that. And so, like, when you say it doesn't work out for the best, like, I mean, I agree that, definitely losing your partner is not for the best. There's no question about that. And I wouldn't argue otherwise. But what do you mean by when you say that?
Well, exactly what you just said, right? We have this narrative that everything works out for the best. Everything happens for a reason. Right. If you just wait long enough, you'll find the gift in what's happened to you. And that's cruel. That is a cruel thing to say, right? I mean, that implies that any terrible thing that happens for you, if you would just change your thinking, you would see how it was good, right? Like, how can you say that to a person whose 7-year-old child died of a random illness? That there will ever be a time, no matter what beauty might come alongside that their child's life was worth it, that their child's death was all part of the bigger plan. Like, this is a basic cruelty.
Right. Yeah. It's a cruelty in the sense that, I mean, the way that I hear you saying it, and how I'm interpreting it is it's a cruelty, and is that it's dismissive of people's pain, right?
Exactly. Yeah. It's dismissive. And that really goes to the heart of where we started talking, right? Like we jumped in at the deep end here of how our culture comes to pain is broken. When we look at somebody's pain and our response to that pain is not acknowledgement, it's not compassion, it's this will all turn out for the good. Well, one, that's wrong timing. No one needs to hear that when they're in pain. And two, that goes against reality. Not everything works out. Not everything is for the best. I mean, how can you say that to communities of color? How can you say that to marginalized people anywhere?
Yeah.
How can you say that to, at the time that we're talking, how can you say that to the people of Puerto Rico? How can you say that your pain and your suffering right now is for the best and it will all work out? Like, this is just foundationally wrong.
It is foundationally wrong. I do get that. But like, what are your thoughts though on and I do fundamentally I agree with you, I do. But what are your thoughts on the nature of attachment and detachment then? And how does that weave into all of this?
So I want to give us a little bit of a bridge here into that. So one of the questions that you asked was, or one of the statements that you made was like, you're a yogi, right? You study spiritual practices and sort of taking that long view.
Yeah.
And that's sort of my world as well. It always has been. And I think we get into trouble when we look at some mystery or the greater cosmic order and try to make that erase human pain. There may very well be a larger cosmic order for things, but it doesn't matter in our lived reality. If we're using that, we can dive into this a little bit more, but like, this is spiritual bypass in a nutshell here, right? Where we say, well, in the long view, right? Your soul agreed to this before you incarnated, right? Like, right. This is just a way to dismiss somebody else's lived reality with the very pretty spiritual clothing of dismissal on top of it. So I think it's tricky. when we start trying to have a spiritual conversation about what does all this mean? Knowing that we stand on this foundation of we really have a hard time acknowledging there are things in this life that are painful and don't have a happy ending to them.
Yeah, there's, well, I mean, if you really take the long view about, oh my gosh, and we're talking about past lives and how karmas, manifest and take form into your current reality and things like that. And those are very lofty ideas. And, I certainly, can't just say, oh, everything is just, karmically related and therefore you just brush it off all so easily. But on one hand, I do feel that, separate from my emotional state or my emotional content, that, the nature of the universe doesn't necessarily go how we want it to go, but it does happen exactly as it should. So people do come and go. And that's just where I just try to sort of make friends with the idea of attachment, or try to get my head around it a little bit in my times of loss.
Yes.
And, and it's just not that I would lay it on anyone else. It's just sort of for my own personal sort of benefit. It's like, well, how else are you going to make sense with death, right?
Well, I think there's a lot in that, right? The issue of attachment is a big one.
Yeah.
I want to take apart a few of the things that you said. So one thing you said is, this is something that I claim for myself, and I would never decide that for somebody else. And I love that, right? We're such a unsolicited advice giving culture, and we decide what is right for everybody. And being able to say, this is what works for me, and being curious, what works for you, right? Being able to allow that what works for us may not work for somebody else, and that both experiences are valid. That's a huge shift right there, just in and of itself.
Yeah.
But this idea that attachment is what causes suffering, I think that is a misunderstanding of the word. I think that attachment, I think we have to unpack that a little bit, right? So we are mammals. Neurobiologically speaking, attachment is survival. We need each other to survive. Our limbic systems need each other to survive.
Yes.
Of course we're attached.
Yes.
To our people, right? Like, we have names for things. We have clinical diagnoses for those who do not form attachments. We call them sociopathic.
Yes.
Of course you're attached to your people. And of course it hurts when they die or we lose them through other means. I think it's easy to, because it hurts, loss hurts, I think it's easy to demonize attachment as the problem. And if only I weren't so attached, this wouldn't hurt so much. So there's that sneaky pain avoidance in there again.
Right.
Right? I think instead, if we lean into attachment and we become more capable or competent with allowing things to hurt instead of trying to get us out of what hurts, then maybe we can use our attachments to help us survive what's asked of us. Right? I think it's again, sort of a handy spiritual sidestep in a lot of ways, where it's used that way, to tell ourselves we shouldn't be in the pain that we're in because attachment is wrong, and I shouldn't be overly attached. Now, don't get me wrong. That idea about letting go of attachment is super duper useful for a lot of things, right? Somebody cuts me off in traffic, I can let go of my attachment to being to my event on time, because that will help me to decrease the rage, those sorts of things.
Yes.
I'm not saying that we need to stop talking about we need to let go of attachment. We need to remember that attachment is actually survival when we're talking about community, when we're talking about love in this world. Attachment is positive and it's important, and it's not something that we should avoid. When we're talking about events or things that are transitory in some ways, right?
Yeah.
Then looking at our attachments and encouraging ourselves to let go, that's useful. But it's not a multi-tool. It's not something that works for every experience of being human. And again, like this is the foundation here, that when we look at the pain of loss as a problem that we need to get out of quickly, that we need to avoid, that we need to soften in some ways, well, maybe not. I mean, centuries of doing that has not been a good thing for us.
Yeah. I definitely. Well, first, before I do, I'm going to pick this back up in a second, but. And I actually wanted to start off the podcast this way, but you just jumped right in.
We jumped right into attachment and the greater cosmic order.
Oh my gosh, and the nature of karma. Everyday tea time conversation here on the podcast. So how you got here. I mean, you know, when you get to your site, refugeandgrief.com, you know, your site definitely has a very, I should say, strong point of view. And, you know, it's okay.
That was very gently put, Zach.
No, I mean, in a beautiful way. I mean, it's very deliberate in what you are offering, what your offering is, and you know, and how you comfort people and help people, and I like that because it's very direct, and anyway, I have a whole sorts of mixed confused feelings about the self-help community. I just love how your language is so direct. It's very, very helpful, and eloquent too. But tell me the story. How did you get here? How did your life turn to such in such a radical 180 that you made it your life's work to help others with grief? What happened?
Yeah. So I've been a practicing psychotherapist for almost 20 years. I think it's 18 this year. I always have to look back and count. So I had been in private practice for a long time, and my partner and I were talking about sort of restructuring things so that I could close my practice, and just sort of wonder what was next. I was feeling pretty tired and pretty burned out, and wanted to find something different. So we were in those discussions, figuring out how to restructure things. Before we got to take any action, Matt died in an accident. So it was a beautiful, ordinary, fine summer day. It had been raining where we lived for about 6 solid weeks. So this was one of the very first sunny days. And we went out for a, quote, quick swim in our home river. And we both, well, 3 of us, because our dog was with us. I always want to include him in the story because he's important.
Yeah, absolutely.
He is. He's very, very important. He's the one who saved me. So it's important that he's in the story. The 3 of us went for a quick dip in our home river, but because it had been raining for 6 solid weeks, the river was flooded and the current was very fast, but you couldn't tell that from the surface. Now, Matt was an incredibly skilled woodsman. We used to joke that he was half mountain goat and he could climb up the face of waterfalls. He was in incredible physical shape and knew that river intimately. We both did. But you couldn't tell from the surface of the water how different she was that day. It was a completely different body of water. And Matt went in for a swim and got swept away by the currents. And I ran into the water after him and got swept away by the currents. And the dog ran in after me. And Boris and I were carried 2 miles down the river before she spit us back out on the shore. And then we were lost in the woods for a few hours.
Oh my goodness.
I always change this because he wasn't lost. The dog wasn't lost. I was, but he followed me. And after a couple of hours being lost in the woods, I gave up. And I looked at the dog and I was like, all right, dude, get us out of here. And he turned around back the way that we had come. And after about 20 minutes, because he knew what he was doing, he led us out into a development where I finally found a house and called for help. And then the wardens came And it was about another 2 hours of rescue divers and search planes. And they eventually drained the river and found Matt's body tangled in some reeds about 6 yards from where I'd last seen him. Mm. And I quit my practice that day. I didn't see my clients again. I never wanted to go back to that work. So Matt's time of death was somewhere around 1:00 in the afternoon. They found him around 3. I would say by 7:00 that evening, people were already telling me that I was going to turn his death around and make it into a gift for other people. That because I was a therapist and a writer and an artist, I would make something so beautiful out of his death. And he had just drowned in front of me. And that language, that pervasive, everything works out for the best, everything works out in the end, everything happens for a reason, that narrative showed up in my life within the same day that I watched him die. Hmm.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's such a... Gosh, well, I mean, also... I mean, back to the Eastern mysticism. I mean, that's also very dharmic, you know. Is that, you know, something so profound and shattering and sad and painful can open up and present itself as just, you know, as, you know, I mean, the ultimate form of higher consciousness is to serve. You know,
yes.
Is to help, is to serve, is to aid, yes. Even through pain. You know, I mean, that's the highest vibrational state that you can be in. And for you to see that and realize that is, in fact, very dharmic. It's very interesting. What, though, I'm curious, though, what is it about the experience that made you detach or become so uninterested in your traditional therapeutic practice?
Well, remembering that I was already feeling kind of tired of the sitting in the office listening thing. So that was in there. Yeah. And honestly, Matt's death nearly destroyed me. Yeah. Right? I mean, there are deaths, there are experiences that reorder the world. When a normal, typical, ordinary, beautiful summer day can shatter in a moment's notice like that, you look at the world differently.
Yes.
I couldn't sit in an office and listen again. Like I couldn't physically, I couldn't do that emotionally. And certainly, you know, one of the things that a lot of people don't know about losses that dissolve the universe is your cognitive abilities change for the first year or two. Right? Like you are literally trying to survive 1 minute to the next.
Right. So you're not going to sit down and, I mean, and listen to someone else's problems about, you know.
And I want to touch on something important that you brought up, that whole idea of dharma and a calling.
Yep.
And I think we say this a lot, that like we use it as an admonition in a way, right? Like we look at the beauty or the usefulness that somebody has created in this world and we say, ooh, I wish that terrible thing didn't happen to them, but boy, they really found their calling in this work. And to me, there's a second half of those sentiments. And that second half is, you know, if somebody looks at me, for example, Zach, and they say, wow, look at the amazing work that you've done and how much you've helped and how many people you've touched through this work. And you wouldn't have done that without Matt's death. Well, the wider connotation there is that I wasn't doing beautiful, useful work before he died. And that I needed this in order to become beautiful and useful in the world. And that his death is worth whatever use someone else gets out of it. Now, I use my example here because it's my personal story and I can speak to it, but this is what we're saying. This is what we're saying when we look at somebody and look at what they've built. And we say, well, I know that it really was a drag that your baby died, but look at the beauty. Look at all of the people that you've helped because of her death. No. right? We're talking about this wrong. We're talking about this wrong, and words matter. We're doing damage when we do this. Now, it is true that out of my experience, I did build something beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
I did build something useful, and I am immensely proud of it. And who knows what I didn't get to create, because this is my path. I think it's easy for us to go to the end game and do a reverse logic map and plot it out, when there are lots of lives that could have been lived. There are lots of ways that people can be beautiful and useful in this world. And there are branches on branches on branches that come off. And I just think it's, I think it's seductive to look at somebody's life trajectory and say, this was meant to be. Well, maybe it's meant to be because it is what it is.
Yeah. Well,
not because it was ordained.
Right. I mean, I think it's the former, not the latter. And that is the very essence of karma. If it's happening, it's happening.
Right.
I mean,
it's happening.
There it is. You can't argue with it.
Yeah.
What was the first thing that you did that day? I mean, you after you found out that he had passed, what happened next? Well, you said you quit your practice and you stopped seeing patients, but
I quit my practice that day. So,
right.
What happened? What happened there? Matt was missing in the river, and the wardens were there with me, and our sweet dog was trying to play with all of the wardens. And the lead warden came to me and said, you can't be here alone. You need to call your best friend. And I said, my best friend is underwater. And he said, okay, we'll call somebody else. And I started running through the contact list in my phone. And the first person who answered was a friend of mine who was also a colleague. So she came to the water and waited with me. And when Matt died, I looked at her and said, I quit. I'm not doing this. You need to close everything. And so that was one of my first acts, was to stop the world. And I had other people to take care of. I had Matt's son and Matt's dad and Matt's mom,
okay.
And my parents. And when death like this erupts into your life, the logistics that suddenly become mandatory and priority, right?
Yeah, sure.
There are landlords to call and funeral homes and research to do about what's legal and what's not legal. There are friends to call. Yeah. I mean, Matt's son and I sat on our bed, Matt's in my bed, and divided Matt's phone contacts into 2 lists and ran down through every single person in his contact list and made a phone call. And I will tell you, the people who answered the phone yelling, Maddie, I'm so glad to hear from you.
Mm-hmm.
And to have to say, sweetheart, it's not Matt, it's me. Are you driving? Because I have something I need to tell you. Over and over and over.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the stuff that, there is, there's no training for that.
No.
There's really no book for that.
There isn't.
No, there really isn't. I came head on with that when I was, my dad died when I was 22. Not a very tragic death in the sense that he was very much ready to die, and it was kind of a long, slow, the long goodbye kind of thing, and we knew it was coming, so it wasn't sudden or anything like that. But by far the most difficult part for me was the logistical stuff. Like, okay, well, now what?
Yeah.
What do you do now?
Yeah.
I'm a 22-year-old kid who has no life experience at all, and definitely threw me for a loop. I could certainly say that. My identity. I learned so much about identity. And my lack of own self-identity. I was like, oh wow, who am I? Trying to figure out the logistics behind someone else's death.
Yeah.
Very, very difficult.
Yeah.
So immediately, you shared that people told you that, you would turn Matt's loss into something great, and, and into, well, I'm being careful with words right now, but, you into something valuable, I should say, and something helpful for others. So did you immediately, how did a book start manifesting itself? Like, how do you,
how do we get from there?
Yeah, how do you get from there into a book? Because, I know a lot of people, Ram Dass is one of my good friends and teachers, and who's done a lot of, work in the grief community. And, and he spent decades sort of thinking about it and and turning his journey and his mystical experiences and consciousness explorations into sort of a map for different aspects of the human condition, including grief. But something like this is so much different, because your life just did a 180, it's like, fuck, oh my God, and this just happened, and what the fuck am I going to do? But then you created this map. But how were you able to see it and put it down on paper in such a way?
And this is such a great question, because I think a lot of what we see, and actually a lot of existing grief resources, they jump from what the fuck just happened to, and here is the transformation story and this book, right? And they miss the transition. They miss the meat of that, right? I often say that, like, a lot of grief books seem to have forgotten what those early days were like, because they're talking about rebuilding your life and moving forward and all of these things, which are all useful and noble things to talk about. But again, I go back to right timing here, that for a lot of people, especially in early grief, and I don't have a tight definition of early grief. One of the best things that somebody said to me soon after Matt died was, with a loss of this magnitude, just happened can mean 8 days ago or 80 years. So I always leave early grief up to each person's definition of that. But those first few years are really difficult, right? It really is a moment by moment survival. And there aren't a lot of resources out there for those early days. And there are a few reasons for that. I think the big one is that we live in a problem solution culture where we see problems and we fix them. Now, that orientation is great for a lot of things, that mastery orientation of fixing things. We see a medical problem and we figure out a solution. We see a technological problem and we figure out a solution, and that's great. However, when somebody's life has just evaporated, when your 4-year-old has a little bit of a cough and then 3 days later is dead from a brain virus, or your fiance is crossing the street at a light with, following all the laws and wearing white clothing and still gets killed by a hit and run driver, right? Like, it's hard to talk about that.
Yeah.
Because we come from a culture of fixing things, we don't really understand that experiences like that aren't problems, which means they don't have a solution. They are experiences that need acknowledgement. They need people to bear witness, to hold space around the horror of that. And that's tricky. It's tricky for people to write about, because they're like, there's nothing we can do. Well, yes, the reality is that there is nothing you can do. And there are things that you can do within that are actually useful, right? So I think that's one of the big problems for me, from my perspective, with most grief resources, that they're speaking to a time when you are starting to lift your eyes to the horizon and wonder what might be next. But there wasn't anything. There wasn't anything written for moment of impact when your life explodes. So, when Matt first died, so I've been a writer since I was a kid. Like, writing is what I do. Right. And I remember, how many times I would be writing in the days and weeks and months after he died and just start stabbing through my notebooks. Like, what the fuck? He's dead and I have words, right? Like, really? This is ridiculous. I can write about our life instead of living our life. What the fuck is this? Right. But you can't take the writer out of me. It's just, it's in there. It's like actually stitched into my very being. But here's the thing. So in those first days and weeks and months and years after Matt's death, I heard more judgment and advice and correction than I'd ever heard in my whole life. Now, I will say that I had a tight band of amazing humans around me. And they often get lost in my storytelling, but I had them and they helped me survive. But by and large, by a big margin, people were bad at this, right? Advice telling me within a couple of weeks after Matt's death that what I most needed to do was go out dancing because that's what the speaker needed to do when she got divorced, right?
Yeah.
Even when people have good intentions, because we don't talk about grief in this culture, we don't know how to talk about grief in this culture. So the things that I got both from friends and family and my wider community, and the therapists were the worst of the bunch. What I got was so dismissive, so not helpful. And in the book, I talk about the difference between pain and suffering. Right. To me, the distinction here.
So I'm sorry. To you, they're what?
Pain and suffering. They're different.
Yes, they're very different.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the way that I talk about it in the book is that, pain is pure. I'm going to stick with my own experience here, and then I'm going to go into what I learned doing the work that I do. The pain of Matt's death couldn't be fixed. Right. Suffering happened when people gave me advice, when people told me that I should stop being sad. I actually had more than one person tell me that I wasn't a very good feminist if I was this upset about losing a man.
What?
Oh yeah, baby.
Oh my God.
And I'm not the only one who's heard that. Like this, what I talk about when I talk about how badly we treat each other when we're in pain, I am not talking about a localized experience. I am talking about something that a huge percentage of the population hears, feels, experiences, and not just in grief related to death, but in the chronic illness community, in the disability community, in communities of color, in the LGBTQ and trans communities. Like, the way that we dismiss and erase other people's lived reality is a pervasive problem.
Boy, when you start kind of taking it into sort of social justice issues like that, that gets very murky to me.
I don't think it gets murky at all. Grief is a social justice issue.
No, but okay, grief is a social, but I mean, like feminism and trans stuff and racism and those being social justice issues as well.
Yeah.
And when somebody's saying that to you, I just think that. Yeah, it really clouds the issue to me because they're not related.
Well, yes and no. They're related in the way that we talk about somebody saying, "Here's my experience and it hurts." And as a culture, we jump in and we say, "No, it doesn't," or "It's your own fault." Oh. That mechanism shows up in grief related to death. It shows up in how we treat women who are coming forward, women and other folks who are coming forward and saying, I was sexually abused or sexually harassed. Yeah. It shows up when communities of color are saying, this is the reality of how I am treated. And we say, no, you're not. That's not true. You just need to think about it more positive. You just need to take more action. When I talk about how we talk about grief in this culture, as I said, when we first started talking, Zach, like, I'm talking with a pretty tight lens on grief related to death.
Yeah.
However, that is the tip of the iceberg. How we come to pain in this culture, any form of pain, how we come to pain in this culture shows up very, very starkly in grief related to death. But it is part of a much bigger foundation of how we come to pain in each other and in ourselves and in the world.
Yes. I mean, just the basic sort of premise, especially around, the Western relationship with pain is, I mean, we're increasingly more so in the world of, as Cornel West refers to, weapons of mass distractions.
Yeah.
And I'm a technologist, and also I'm a purveyor of a lot of these distractions in a way as well. But that, we have so many methods and routes and, tools to distract ourselves and to numb ourselves from experiencing pain. I mean, there are more than ever before, from drugs to social media to sex to the internet to,
Absolutely. So. And we can go back to your question about attachment when we're speaking about this, right?
Yeah.
And speaking neurobiologically, right, about attachment, I am not a neurobiologist. I just have enough information to be dangerous. But when we see somebody in pain, our limbic systems, our minds automatically begin to relate to them, because that is how mammals work, right? Yeah. We see somebody else in pain and our bodies recognize that could be me. That could be me. We share that pain. We share that potential for harm and for loss and for pain. And then the front of our brain gets a hold of that and goes, oh, fuck, that could be me. Let me make some distance here. Let me detach. Let me make sure that I cannot be that person, right? Yeah. We do this in grief. We do this in a lot of other ways, right? And so looping back to that transition that you asked me about. So, I trained as a cheesemaker for a while. I worked on farms.
As a cheesemaker?
As a cheesemaker, baby. I wanted out of the helping humans world, because I was in pain, and because I was in pain, and because I just, like, that was what I needed. I needed quiet. I needed cows. I needed goats. Cows don't care if you sob on their flanks, right? Like, it's fine.
Yeah.
But so back when I was first widowed, so it was 2009, and it's hard to believe, but back then blogs weren't really a thing. They hadn't really started the way that we know about them now. And, doing a Google search for young widow or accidental death, widow, whatever, the resources that I found for widowed people were largely aimed to people over 70, because we know that's the only time that people die, or they were heavily religious, which did not work for me. The other minority in there of resources for accidental death was really heavily peppered with rainbows and puppy dogs and things work out for the best. And there's a silver lining to everything, which was offensive and annoying to me before Matt's death and just violently disgusting to me afterwards. Right? Like, I got nothing against rainbows and puppy dogs. And there are some things that are really hard that actually work out well for your own growth and development. Death is not one of those things. Right? It's not a multi-tool. And I found my people, my community, by tracking comments in very obscure blogs back then. And, one of the things that I say about that original tribe of mine is we found each other by becoming findable. We were out there talking about the reality of what it was like to live what we were living. I mean, I've said this a few times. I've been a writer since I was tiny, and I've always believed during this life that writers change the world. We have all of the advances that we have, socially speaking, because people chose to write about their reality. People chose to make themselves findable through their words. And so I found my people because they were writing, because we were all writing, because we were willing to make ourselves findable. And those people helped me more than anyone else ever could or ever did. And they helped me because we all told the truth to each other. We all were able to sit with each other and hear how horrible this is, to hear stories about what it's like to watch your partner waste away in front of you, to know about making those phone calls that I talked about earlier, Zach, like to be able to talk with somebody who knows exactly what you mean when you talk about the tone of somebody's voice, when you have to break their heart by telling them the news. Being able to tell the truth together helped all of us survive. And this is why I do the work that I do, Zach, because I couldn't let people come into the world of grief after me and find the wasteland that I found. Not if I could do something about it. And, I'm good at what I do. I'm a really good writer. Yeah. I am smart and articulate and I know my stuff. And I couldn't not say anything, right? Because I know what it's like to be on that floor. I know what it's like to look at the world and say, none of this belongs to me anymore. Nobody understands. I know what that feels like. And if I can do something to make that different for somebody, then damn fucking right, I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what about the idea of, how can I just sort of phrase this? What about the idea of, I guess I would say healthy detachment in the form of how you move on after death? Not in the sense of that you move on like you ignore the pain and erase memories or anything like that. I don't mean that. It's just how you pick yourself up from the floor that you were talking about and kind of get on with your life. Yep. And in some cases, I don't know if it's the case with you or with, I think in this specific example I'm going to bring up, I think about Paul McCartney a lot. I don't know why, I just do.
Because, he's just in there.
Yeah, he's just in there because, Linda was his wife and partner for, almost 40 years. And, she passed away from cancer. And, pretty quickly he found another partner and had another child afterwards, in his mid 60s, and I always looked at that from afar being like, well, that's interesting. How did that work? Mm-hmm. Like he made such quick work of that from a public perspective that I was goodness, how does that work?
Yeah. So I think it's really tempting to look at the outward evidence of somebody's life and say, well, they tidied that up really quickly and put that behind them.
Yeah, I didn't think of it as tidying it up. I thought of it just as just more like, how did that work? Like,
I don't know.
Up or what?
Yeah. So here's the thing. Pretty quickly, I'm doing air quotes here that nobody can see, but I'm doing them pretty quickly. There isn't any timeline there, right? I think we also have an idea that if we're talking about being widowed, right, that finding another partner is a resolution step. And that's not necessarily accurate. It's the same thing if you look at somebody who had a miscarriage and they have an additional child and we say, well, then you're resolved and you're moving on. So what I really want to stress here is that whatever you add to your life after a loss, I don't even care what kind of loss it is. I think we can talk about the additive process here, that we lay things down alongside what's broken, but it doesn't mean that we're not still broken, right? Liam Neeson is one of my favorite celebrity examples of this. He speaks beautifully about his wife's death and his ongoing grief. Yeah. And he works, he acts, he's doing his life. Yeah. And it doesn't cancel out that pain. And I think that if we start thinking about recovery, I'm not a big fan of the phrase moving on, but we'll use it for the moment. Moving forward, let's use that instead. It's an additive process. You are laying things down next to whatever is broken in your life. If we're going to use detachment here, I think we can, if we have to, I don't want us to be using attachment, detachment, non-attachment when it comes to human hearts. I think that's wrong. I think we can use it when we're looking at what I wanted for this life. I wanted this, I wanted this, I wanted this. Okay, well, those aren't options right now. How can I best companion myself given what is? What beauty can I lay down next to this as my companion? Not to make it better, not to put a rosy ass spin on things, but how do I seek out things that companion what is true for me right now? This goes to what we started talking about a bit ago about the difference between pain and suffering.
Yeah.
How do I reduce my suffering? If I am continually rehearsing, to use sort of a therapy spin on things right now, I mean, we do get to choose the stories in our heads, right? I can sit here and rehearse every rotten thing that somebody intentionally or unintentionally has said to me, right? I can do that. Or I can say, yep, people have been jerks, and I'm going to choose to turn my attention right now to the people who have been beautifully awkward and loving and kind. And I'm going to put my thoughts there. I'm going to detach my thought pattern from those thought patterns that increase my suffering. And I'm going to turn them to things that increase my sense of companionship, my sense of support, my sense of being held. Beautiful. And in doing that, life moves.
Yeah.
Right? So again, I really want us to check our foundation. Where are you standing when you're throwing out these terms about attachment and non-attachment and recovery, and where are you standing? Because if you're standing on grief is a problem to be solved, you have to get over this, which is, honestly, it's really easy to stand there. It's what the culture tells us.
Well, I think they can parallel path.
Yeah, sure.
They can exist at
exactly.
on simultaneous planes.
Right? I mean, we are complex beings, and we hold seemingly disparate elements all the time.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
There's a story that sometimes people ask me this question about, as we're speaking now, Zach, I'm about 8.5 years out from that stuff. Yeah. And I can look around at my life, and it's been this way for a number of years now. I can look around at my life and be like, my life is amazing. My life is beautiful. And not even a quarter of a second afterwards will come, and Matt's dead. Huh. Well, that's weird. Right? And there's not going to be a resolution for that. It's something that is part of me. It's something that's integrated. It's never going to be okay. And there is beauty in this life for me. And I've found it and, dived into it and all of these things by telling the truth about how hard things are. Right?
Yes. While also simultaneously doing all of this other work that has created, these different kind of planes of existence for you. You can pick yourself up off the floor while part of your soul is probably still on the floor.
Oh, sure. And so two things here. One is that howling, that screaming, that on the floor, that lasted a lot longer than most people think.
Yeah. Right.
This is not you get 6 weeks and then you should be back to normal. That's wrong. And, there's a line that somebody picked up a year or two ago in a podcast that I did where, there's a part of me that never stopped screaming. And that's always going to be true.
Yeah. 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 And, there's a great, in the 12-step world, the great adage about how pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional.
Exactly.
And that, in addicts, the addict condition, I mean, like all conditions, but the addict condition is sort of more hyper-attuned and hypersensitive to pain avoidance mechanisms.
Sure.
And shoves it down with, whatever your poison of choice is.
Yep.
And, and that reality can also extend into the field of, if you're a recovering substance abuse user, you can simultaneously be in recovery and want to be in recovery, but the idea of using again comes up.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and you can deal with it and make friends with
Yep.
it and be like,
Exactly.
Yeah, one doesn't have to.
Isn't that interesting? What does it point to? Yeah, exactly. And this is a good point here, Zach, that sometimes people ask me about, what about people who are stuck in their grief? And my response here is, you want to know what stuck in grief looks like. Stuck in grief looks like epidemics of substance addiction. It looks like interpersonal violence, right? Because we use whatever the substance is, whether it's a behavior or a substance or, any of those things, we use because there is pain and because pain is hard. And if we don't have ways to talk about what hurts in ways that are acknowledged and witnessed and understood without being fixed or shushed or shamed or stuffed down, if we can't do that, then we create individuals, families, communities, cultures who are stuck in grief, right? And if you can't say that something hurts, it doesn't make the hurt go away. It just makes you really desperate to mask it or to handle it. So, I love that what you bringing up recovery and addiction, right? Like when you have an urge to use, what does this say? This says something hurts. And one of my reflexes is to take the edge off that hurt. Okay, well, what are some other ways I might companion or ask into what's hurting, right? I mean, I don't want to, wrap up our time together or think about sort of closing things on a downer note, because there are things you can do to companion yourself and to companion others inside your pain. We don't just have two options, right? Like you either suck it up, stop being so attached, find the silver lining, go start a foundation and make something beautiful. Like that's option one. Or option two is, okay, go rock in the basement in a corner by yourself and be terribly depressed for all eternity. Like those aren't our only two options. That's what the culture says the options are. Mm-hmm. But there is a middle ground there. And that middle ground is in companionship. It's in acknowledging what hurts. It's in opening personal conversations and community conversations and cultural conversations about how we show up for each other.
Yeah, it's about not hiding from it, right? Showing up for each other. And when you were telling that story earlier about finding the others on sort of these these deeply seated blog sites where you guys were sort of
much more common, much more easy to find now, but back then it was not easy.
I bet. And you guys found each other and you found refuge and community, and we know from a lot of neuroscience and analysis now that actual endorphins and serotonins are released when we engage in community and talk about these things that otherwise were secret,
Absolutely. And there is something that happens when you are allowed to tell the truth.
Yes.
There is something that happens. It makes it different, right? And I've been running an online writing course pretty much every month for the last 5 years. And it's sort of an acknowledgement laboratory. In the writing course, there's no advice allowed. There's no there's no everything happens for a reason posting. There's no outside memes, but people tell the truth. And the only reflection you're allowed to give back is to mirror somebody's truth back to them. It seems like it would be too simple to be of use, but it is incredible. It's incredible what being allowed to tell the truth about your own life means. It changes things.
Yes, it sure does. I mean, it's amazing what a little bit of clarity will do, right?
Yeah. It's not just clarity. I mean, that's in there. It's not just clarity, though. We spend so much time defending our right to be in pain.
Yes.
Claiming or defending our right to our own experience as we live it, that being in a space where you can say what is true for you and have somebody say, yes, that is true for you, instead of trying to take that truth away from you, Like, that is magical. That is powerful. And that's what we need.
It sure is. It sure is. Do you feel a connection to Matt's soul?
Sure.
Still, and
Yeah.
sort of, and sort of you know, and even on a day-to-day level, do you sort of, can you feel his presence and still, yeah?
Yeah. And I think that feeling his presence is one of those phrases that means 8 million different things, right?
Yeah, it does.
But things like, gosh, I wish I could think of the joke. I was out somewhere the other day and somebody said something in my head. I could hear his voice come up with a joke. And I was like, oh my God, you're hilarious. Right? Like his being, his humor, his wit, his mind, is so deeply stitched into me that he's still making one-liners. Right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's beautiful because, yeah, I think, you know, I mean, it's sort of the eternal question about, you know, the manifest versus the unmanifest, and you know, and what is consciousness? Is it something that's embodied within us, or is it disembodied? If you cease to exist on the physical plane, I don't think consciousness ceases to exist. You know, so
yeah. Well, I think I'm still fascinated by all of this stuff, right? And I think one of the big things that's different for me as a student of this, from sort of the pre-death time to now, is I think of it as the more than we know, right? There's so much that we don't know just in the earth sciences, right? Just in physics. There's so much that we know now about the natural world that we didn't know 20 years ago, right?
Yeah.
And if we don't know things, if we're still discovering things about our incarnated reality planes here, how can we ever begin to claim we know what else there is? Now, you know, when I hear a one-liner, in Matt's sense of humor in my head, is that my brain being cool, right? My brain adapting and speaking in his voice because it's part of my memory banks? Or is it some essence of Matt? Honestly, I don't know. And I don't think it matters. Right? I don't think it matters. I think that there is always more than we know. One of my favorite phrases is too precise to be random, right? There are things that happen that are, coincidence or not coincidence. And there are things that are just so bloody precise that it would be hard, and I think maybe heartless, to say there's no greater order to anything. I don't believe that, right?
Yeah.
And do I know what that is? And will I make any claims about it? No. Nope. Because what I do know is that I don't know a fraction of what is.
Yes. Well, one of the great spiritual cliches of our time: whatever you think reality is, that's not it.
Right.
We can certainly make up wonderful assimilations and make our way through this wonderful mystery of life. But I could talk about this for another hour with you for sure. But there's a lot to really get into here, and I didn't even really get into my notes from your book. I can't believe it. So maybe we'll do it again some other time. But it's really been a pleasure. I really, really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.